Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here. Got another Master Duel video for you. And you're probably seeing this and thinking, wait, another tier list video? Did we not literally just have one? We did. However, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different today. This is going to be our year-end review for 2023 for Master Duel. So I wanted to do a sort of year-end review kind of video. Actually, shout out to, I believe it was Abe over on the Patreon who kind of suggested the idea, and I was like, oh, that's actually a really good idea. And I have previously done something a little bit similar to this, where we ranked like every Master Duel format ever. We did that earlier this year, but I wanted to do one specifically for the year of 2023. I thought it'd be fun to not only kind of just put all the different seasons from this year on a tier list just to indicate how much I like them, but we're also going to go back and look at previous tier lists that I made, because I made a tier list video for almost every season, and the ones that were exceptions we'll definitely see why when we get to them. But yeah, we can go back and take a look at those, see how right or wrong I was, and just kind of talk about the meta at that point in time. So yeah, a fun little idea. Again, thanks Abe over on Patreon for that. I think some people in the Discord also had a similar suggestion as well. So thank you everyone who suggested. Also, like, I am always open to ideas for video suggestions, because I am really good at getting in my own head too much about what I do or what I think people do or don't want to see. So if you have any suggestions ever, like, always feel free to leave them in the comments of the YouTube videos. If you're on the Discord, I have a channel for suggestions. Yeah, always open to them. So without further ado, let us go ahead and start here. Alright, so Season 13 is going to be, I have that represented, each season is represented by a card that was a major release around that time. So Season 13 I have represented by Mathmech Circular here. Let's take a look at that tier list. Okay, so going back, I realized, and I think this is actually going to be a bit of a recurring thing here, is that I actually often make the tier list right at the beginning of the month, which means it tends to come out before the pack release. So Mathmech is not represented here. However, pretty much every other deck in that meta was. So this was, I guess, the pre-pack release tier list that I made here. It's still pretty indicative of what the meta was like. The only thing missing is obviously Mathmech in Tier 1, alongside Branded Despia and Sword Soul. Sky Striker, I think, looking back, I think I would have bumped that up to Tier 2 as well. Because remember, the major release at that time was the not even the selection pack at the time, but actually the secret pack that contained both Mathmech and Sky Striker's got a huge update to include Mathmech Circular and Sky Striker Mobilized Linkage, which greatly boosted the powers of both decks, but particularly Mathmech definitely rose to definite Tier 1 status in my opinion. In fact, I think, yeah, the Season 2 of the MCS of Season 1, sorry, Week 2 of Season 1 of the MCS, I actually topped with Mathmech. So, I mean, it was a very, very good deck at the time. I think in my previous tier list I made of every Master Duel format ever, I actually put this as my #1 favorite, because I think this was a pretty healthy meta overall. Like, especially if you think back to the top decks of the meta, which again, in my opinion, would have been Mathmech alongside, as we see here, Branded Despia and Sword Soul Tenyi. Not only were none of those decks, like, super noticeably stronger than the other, they all three felt about the same power level. None of them really felt oppressive either. We were coming up on December's release. Leading up to this had been Runic and Labyrinth were the big ones. Labyrinth at the time didn't have its full release, so it was like, it was a solid deck, but it wasn't really putting up too many impressive results. Oh, Runic. Have we really had a year of people moaning about Runic? At the time, it debuted very, very popularly, and the stun variant, I think, was the most popular slash, you know, slow kind of mill out variant. This was when everything was at 3. I put it in upper tier 2, but in hindsight, if you think about how strong that deck actually was in the meta, and especially if you look at tournament results as opposed to ladder results, it really wasn't like, it wasn't that bad. Yeah, like all of the Runic cards at 3 was probably a bit much. I was an advocate of Tip going to 1, and I'm surprised Tip never did go to 1, but, yeah, I don't know. I think lower tier 2, maybe upper tier 3 might have been a better spot for Runic at the time, but, yeah, I think for, like, you know, overall this was a pretty spot on. So where does that leave Season 13 as far as where we are going to put it on the tier list? Well, like I said, last time I had this as my favorite Master Duel meta ever. And I don't think it's just the fact that there are some later ones that might end up getting placed higher, but also, as time goes on, your opinions about things tend to change. At least, people who mature and grow do that. But, Season 13, I think I'm still definitely going to put it in S tier. It's probably still just my favorite meta of this past year, but I could be wrong. I'll have to think about it a little bit more. But yeah, no, I think there was a definite S tier meta. Like I said, it was like, it felt very healthy. Some people might have thought that Runic was a little bit too powerful, but I think it was fine. No one deck felt any head or shoulders above the others. Even the 3 tier 1 decks that I mentioned in Mathmech, Sword Soul Tenyi, and Branded Despia, even though those were pretty clearly better than all the other decks in the meta, it was not by much at all. And again, even among those 3 decks, no one truly felt stronger than the other. So that was overall a very balanced meta, I thought. It was also... It's funny. It was also the last meta of what I thought of as kind of like the sort of pre-2023 power level of Master Duel. Because in Season 14, and as card releases moved forward, I feel like there was a noticeable jump in the power level of the overall meta. Like, it kind of felt like we were taking Yu-Gi-Oh! To the quote-unquote next level in some regards. At least, like, that's kind of my interpretation of it, so... And speaking of that point, that very point was in Season 14, in my opinion, with the release of Sprites. Sprites did come in somewhat nerfed. I think they pre-banned Totally Awesome, and they pre-hit Sprite Starter to 2. So even though they were coming in with a bit of a nerf to how they played upon release in like the TCG/OCG, Sprite was definitely still, I think, the heralding of kind of that next power level of releases to come. Sprite upon release felt very, very much head and shoulders above the rest of the meta. And if we look at the tier list that I made after Sprites came out, this was like around the end of Season 14, but this was, yeah, after Sprites had come out and definitely established themselves in the meta. It's funny, because like, if you look at this tier list and compare it to the last one, you can just see how Sprites just pushed everything else down. Everything that was tier 1 before just got shuffled down to tier 2, with Pure Sprite, Twin Sprite, and especially Runic Sprite being some of the most notable variants here. So, and at this time, I put Runic Sprite above Pure Sprite, and I think that was generally true. That while those two were the top decks of the meta, Runic Sprite was generally viewed as being stronger. And again, this was before Runic had any sort of hits, so that definitely makes sense to me, for sure. And I think ultimately it was Runic Sprite, looking back, that caused Runic to take the hits, and I think those were deserved hits at that time. I think there's a bit of revisionism when you look at the Runic hits and be like, oh yeah, well, at least I've seen people say like, oh yeah, Konami definitely took out those Runic cards to curb stun before, so they should have done it, more in the future in order to keep curbing Runic stun. But no, I don't think Runic cards were curbed because of Runic stun. I think it was because of Runic Sprite, actually. And if you think about how Konami tends to like to hit cards, it definitely makes sense that I think it was following this list that they semied a bunch of the Runic cards, right? And that makes sense because although Runic Sprite and Sprite in general was the main powerhouse of the meta, it's not like they were ever going to hit Sprite when it just come out. So hitting the Runics, which people already didn't like because of Runic Stun, and the deck was already bolstering the power of Sprite to the top deck of the meta, definitely makes sense to hit Runic. And, like, yeah, I know I always say that, like, oh, they shouldn't hit cards just because people don't like them, but that doesn't mean they don't do it. And I will say, to a degree, that can be a factor as to why cards get hit. But again, in this case, people not liking Runic cards was a factor on top of the already main reason of Runic Sprite being the best deck of the meta. So when I say that hating cards is not a reason for them to get banned, it should not be the only reason they get banned. But I understand why that can be an additional factor in terms of a card that should already be looked at for its power level within the meta. So, but yeah, Twin Sprite, that was like the next best one. We had Tri Sprite down here in tier 3, which I think was pretty fair. Yeah, I don't know, not to toot my own horn or anything, but 2-2, I think I kind of I think I kind of nailed this tier list. I think this was just about where the meta was at the time in terms of decks' respective power levels. So, okay, so as far as where that puts Season 14, I mean, I think this is where things might differ for me a little bit, in my opinion. I don't know, though, because, like, on one hand, I think to myself, like, Sprite has definitely become, over the course of this year, just my favorite archetype. I love not only the theming and the artwork and the style and the aesthetic of the cards themselves, but I love that Sprite is not only its own competent deck, but it lifts up so many other archetypes into more meta relevance. And at this point, especially at the time I'm recording this video, it is definitely more of an engine than its own deck, which makes me a little bit sad. People dog on Elf a lot for like keeping other cards down, but let's be real. Blue, Jet, and Nimble Beaver. I think all three of those cards could come back to 3 right now, and Sprite would definitely shoot up in power level, but I don't think it would be too oppressive or a problem. I don't think Elf is holding any of those cards back. There is an argument that Elf is holding back, like, Totally Awesome, and perhaps Swap Frog, just like that kind of frog engine in general. But I'm also of the opinion that if you just banned Ronin Totem, Swap could come back definitely with Elf still around. Totally is a bit of a, that and Elf coexisting is a little bit but I mean, we'll see. Although, to be fair, we also have SP Little Knight coming out pretty soon, and I kind of wonder if that card can actually coexist with Elf. But we'll deal with that when it comes. As far as this season, when Sprites debuted, I'm trying to think of like how I feel about that season looking back, and also how I felt about that season at the time. I'm a little bit conflicted. At the time, I definitely thought season 13 was like where it was at. I was a little bit sad that Sprite had just like kind of, again, forced all the previous tier 1 decks down to tier 2. I'm going to put it in A tier, because I do think if you look at that tier list and compare it to the previous meta, the meta was definitely a bit less open. I will say, although Sprites are my favorite archetype ever in Master Duel, and they came out in this season, I think I had more fun playing in Season 13 than I did in Season 14. And then there was Season 15. So we all knew that tier limits were like on the horizon, and a lot of us thought they were just going to follow Sprite directly. But rather, we were surprised, and Konami pulled a very experimental move. I think probably the most experimental decision they made in the whole year when it comes to card releases within Master Duel, which was to give us the Ishizu cards, that being, we all know, right? Yugioh, Kelbeck, Ludora, and Keldo. I always mix up Kelbeck and Keldo. But they all came in at 2, if I recall correctly. They were pre-semi-limited, but that definitely did not stop them from being meta-relevant, even before the tier limit cards came out. And yet, despite the Ishizu cards having some definite meta-relevance upon release, I don't think it ever served to really dethrone Sprite or Runic Sprite. Looking back at tournament results and comparing that against the tier list here, I think that pretty much lines up. This was, by the way, after Runic cards did take a hit. It was between that last tier list and this one that, Fountain and like 4 of the other quick play spells went to 2. But as you can see, all that really caused within the tier 1 like itself was for Pure Sprite to become then better than Runic Sprite. But I think it was fair to say, too, that Runic Sprite was definitely still better than, like, all these other decks. And as you can see, it's actually kind of hard to tell with the images that I made it here, but Adamantipator here and Dragon Link have Yugioh in the corner because they were very much being boosted by the Ishizus. I don't think Dragon Link actually ever ended up utilizing the Ishizus that much. I don't think I was correct to put Dragon Link with Ishizus at tier 2 as like the 4th best deck in the meta. From what I recall, that never really ended up panning out. And I think I actually undervalued the kind of pure mill deck. Yugioh here is representing the like Necroface style mill deck. That, I think, was actually better than I gave it credit for it. Excuse me, at the time. I think Flandreese was also a little bit better than I was giving it credit for at the time, too. I feel like these two should be in tier 2, and the Dragon Link should be in, like, tier 3. But, yeah, I mean, Branded Despia, Mathmech, and Sword Soul were definitely still holding on. Although, to be fair, you tended to see less Mathmech around this time, from what I remember. Just because, like, Braided Despia and Sword Soul were kind of like established good decks, but I don't think MathMech ever really, with Circular, ever really had a chance to like leave new deck hype before new deck hype surrounded sprites and then a Shizu card. So I think MathMech was probably at this point in time a little bit underexplored. Like, as far as its actual representation in the meta, at this point in time, my tier list placement is wrong. It should be in tier 3. But in terms of MathMech's power level at the time, I think it probably was still a tier 2 deck. So, yeah, and then, okay, I will say this too about Adamanticators with the Shizus. This should honestly also be in tier 3. Around this time, I was really, really on this deck, and I was very, very convinced that people were sleeping on this deck. I thought Adamanticators with Shizus was actually a tier 1 deck. And to be fair, we did only get 1 month to explore the Shizu cards before the tier limits came out, and then their most, you know, their best application became a lot more obvious. But yeah, I think that this should probably be down in tier 3. And again, this just overall Necroface kind of milled deck with the Shizu cards, as well as probably Flaundery should be in tier 2, I think, here. Also, looking back, it is pretty clear, right, the reason why they released. I mean, we kind of knew this at the time too, but like, especially looking back, it is much more clear why they released the Shizu cards before they released the tier limit cards, right? And I think it's because they wanted to limit the Shizu cards without having to hit the tier stuff. Again, Konami has definitely shown they do not want to hit cards that are URs that are currently in packs that are in the shop, because those are the obvious incentives to sell said packs with people's, you know, causing people to buy gems with money. So yeah, I mean, in hindsight, it's pretty obvious. So with not only that in mind, but also like how I felt about the format. It was a very weird format. I think we can all agree that this was a very weird time to be playing Master Duel. I think too, looking at like the rest of the seasons, season 15 was the weirdest. I'm gonna put it in D, honestly. Like, at the time, I remember thinking that, oh, Adamanticator Shizu is so good and it's such a cool deck, but like, even then, like, if I think about how much fun I had playing that deck as opposed to how much fun I had playing like just about any other deck, the fun relative to other decks was not had as much as, you know, with other decks. And it was a weird meta that was created because Konami clearly wanted to push the Shizu cards down because here's the thing, Konami knew that a Shizu tier was going to be a problem. And that was kind of the thing that we all knew. We all knew that they knew that too, right? So, yeah, it was just such an obvious, like, money-making decision to put the Shizu cards, to have them come out, you know, when they did. I'm comfortable putting this down in D. This was, like, one of my least favorite. This might have actually been, looking at, again, at the rest of the seasons here, this might have just been my least favorite season of the entire year. So, oh, in season 16, did we ever see a very powerful deck? Tearlament came out in full force. What was pre-hit? Was Pearl Rhino pre-hit? I think Pearl Rhino was pre-hit to 1, if I recall correctly. But yeah, the Shizu cards, I mean, those were obviously also pre-hit when they came out as well. But this was as full of power as we ever saw Tearlament in Master Duel, right? So, yeah, a lot of people probably would not like this meta. Well, okay, first let's actually look at our quote-unquote tier list. And honestly, I don't have a tier list for you because I didn't make one. I didn't make tier lists for this season or the next one because at the time it just felt super pointless, honestly. And looking back, yeah, I think that decision was justified because most of the tier list would have been talking about just how much better Tearlament was than everything else. And at that point in time, trying to figure out where every deck that wasn't Tearlament was on the tier list really just felt like nitpicking. The other weird thing, too, is that, like, this was a quote-unquote tier 0 meta in that, like, Tearlaments was so much stronger that, like, it was the undisputed tier 1 deck, and it doesn't even feel like you could even put anything in tier 2 because nothing else felt like it even came quite as close. So, here I have my first ever build of Tearlament. This is the first build I played in Master Duel. This is my initial list here. And yeah, I also forgot that they, of course, pre-hit all the fusers to 2 as well. Duh. Also, Mudora was not pre-hit to 2. I totally forgot about that. Mudora was the one Ishizu card that came in at 3. So, looking back at my build here, I think it was alright. I don't think I needed to play Foolish Burial Goods quite at this time. I probably could have just played a 3rd Celiac instead if I really wanted to. But for everything that was legal, also Orange Herald, I don't think that ever really panned out. Probably because it was pre-limited to 1 is why that card never panned out. But in hindsight, I don't think that card or Diviner was super worth really playing in this style of a tier limit deck. Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely would have dropped, again, the Orange Herald, the Diviner, the Foolish Burial Goods. Maybe played some more relevant tech. I don't know that 3 Imperm was necessarily the best thing you could be playing. As far as the extra deck goes, like IP Avermax Elf line in tier limits obviously never really panned out or anything, but yeah, I think this build overall was like not the worst for the first build of tier limits, but yeah, again, I didn't even bother making a tier list at the time, and I think it was pretty obvious why. So if I think back personally to where I would put this season on the tier list, again, I think a lot of people would just put it here. A lot of people just did not like how strong the deck was at the time. I'm going to put it in B, though, because while I think I did have more fun exploring all the different sprite variants as opposed to only tier limit, at the same time, I will say that it was cool. It was cool to explore the deck and like know that we were getting such a strong deck in and just trying to figure out the best way to build this one deck. And I will say this, although I personally do value metas where there's a lot more of a deck diversity, which there was not in Season 16 or the couple that followed, really, due to how strong tier limit was, there is also the argument that tier 0 metas are the most skill testing, because when everyone is on generally the same archetype, not only your individual techs within your build matters more and how you build that deck, but also how you play the mirror match matters a lot. And in that regard, those tend to be the most skill testing metas. So it's kind of this paradox, right? Where for me personally, and I think a lot of people tend to agree, that formats with a high deck variety are more fun. But I do also see the argument that, and I also generally think this is true as well, that decks or formats with lower deck variety tend to be more skill testing. And I can 100% understand why people think that's more fun. So, as always, as ever, it just comes down to however you feel. There's no like one right answer, but I thought exploring tier limit in this format was fun, so I'll put it in B tier. I thought, again, exploring the various sprite variants was a little bit more fun, but yeah. Okay, Season 17. I put Naturia Mole Cricket here because, like, the selection pack that came out at this time, I think, was one of the least impactful in its like relative meta. Like, what was it? It was like Naturia and Goaty, right? Came out in this pack, and it's like, I don't know. This was basically, although I have it represented by Naturia Mole Cricket, because to be fair, Naturia Runic did prove to be a relevant meta force, this meta was still very much characterized by tier limit. Okay, so I figured, because again, this was another season where I didn't end up making a tier list, because again, tier limit just felt head and shoulders above everything else. I'm using another just tier limit build I had at the time. This was actually the tier limit deck that I top 8'd with at the MCS. Also, the next week after this, and I can't believe I forgot this when I was talking about the selection pack just now, that pack had a Soul Synchron in it. Although, of course, the Nature cards, you know, in an objective lens, were the most impactful for the overall Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta. God, that Assault Synchron was definitely the most impactful release of the year for me, I can tell you that for sure. But yeah, so this was the build I topped MCS week, whatever it was, with tier limit, and this is pretty much like almost the exact same deck. This is again why I didn't really bother making a tier list for this time, because it all kind of started to feel a little samey. Granted, at this point in the meta, again, Naturia Runic was debatably like a tier 2 deck. there just wasn't enough significant changes to Tier Limit itself to really oust it, I think, as the best deck at that time. Oh, but you know what? I will say, I was actually just about to move on, but I will say that we did see some really cool innovation with Tier Limit at this time, like Jesse Cotton, bringing in the Zodiac package. It was so good. People started to get on Dugaris, which was very good. Baguska, people started realizing how important Baguska was in the mirror match. For like various situations, like if you got Max Seed, sometimes you just go into Baguska, or just to like pivot into the Zeus was a good reason to go into it. Abyss Dweller, oh my god, Abyss Dweller like defined this whole meta. Like your use of Abyss Dweller in the mirror match was very often the determinant factor of how that mirror match played out. And yeah, as you can see, at this point I had ousted the Orange Herald. The Diviner's no longer here. We did get back on Foolish Burial Goods because Instant Fusion got banned, was the big ban list update, which obviously was like not that impactful to tier limits overall. Also, Foolish Goods went to 1 at this time. So at the time, like, we were all like, huh? To Foolish Burial Goods going to 1? But I've actually thought about this, like, even in recent months. I think it's totally fine for this card to be at 1. Like, what do you think about, especially, like, as more and more just cards in general come out? What do you think about how many spell and trap cards benefit from being sent directly from the deck to the graveyard? Like, yeah, giving every deck that wants that, like, 3 copies of the ability to do so. Like, I think we're at the point where Foolish Burial Goods is probably about, not quite as strong, of course, but it's getting close to as strong as regular Foolish Burial. And if that card on principle should just be at 1 because of all the things it enables, I think the same is generally true of Foolish Burial Goods. Now, I think the card could be at 2 or even 3 right now, and it would probably be fine. But I think with the idea of, and normally I don't necessarily get behind limiting or banning cards to quote-unquote open design space, but when we're talking about spell and trap cards as a whole, yeah, I'm a little more inclined to think, okay, maybe Foolish Burial Goods should be at 1 so that more spell and trap cards in general can want to go to the graveyard and not be too abusable. I think that's fine. So as far as where that's going to put this season on the tier list, I'm just gonna put it directly behind season 16, I think. Like, part of me wants to put it in C, actually. You know what? Okay, I'm actually going to put it... Okay, so this is where the tier list... This is a me personal thing. This is what I personally feel about the various seasons. I was thinking about season 17 right now in the general, frame of, oh, tier limit was still around and it was still pretty much the same thing, which is why I would have put it a little bit lower than season 16. But again, when I think about my own personal experience with Season 17, man, we got a Salt Synchron, and that was so cool, and I topped with Pug Sprite, and it was so much fun. I'm going to put it a little bit above Season 16, actually. For that reason, it's going to push this meta above Season 16 for me. Which, again, I'm looking at this tier list in particular and thinking, like, this is how I feel about the metas? Like, yeah. Well, honestly, if it's how I feel about the metas, and we're thinking about, like, just the rush that I got from topping with it. Yeah, I'm just going to put it up here, actually. So, if this tier list is my personal year-in review and how I personally felt about each of the seasons, I definitely had the most fun playing Yu-Gi-Oh! This year, getting top 16 with Punk Sprite, because that definitely spurred on me to just play that style of deck for, like, the rest of the year up until about this point when Chaos Ruler is about to get banned. But, yeah, no, I changed my mind. Again, before I was thinking about tier limit in Season 17, which to be fair, a lot of people were, but nah. When I think about Assault Synchron, I put it at the top of SBB. Season 18, this is when the Bestials came out, and to me, this is when I think tier limits really felt like they were kind of starting to drag, because, like, I don't know, some people may argue that the Bestials added some interesting counterplay against tier limits. You also got to remember that it was mostly tier limits that were having the interesting counterplay against tier limits with the Bestials in their own deck. And this all kind of fed into, like, this black hole that was, like, Bestial Ishizu tier limit, where, because like I've said before, even recently, when Bestials are good, Bestials get even better to counter other Bestials. So when you already have the most powerful deck of the meta, seeing by far the most amount of play, and now you have counterplay that the deck itself uses that also feeds into itself because it counters itself, again, we just end up in this black hole of Bestial Tearlament Ishizu. Now, granted, around this time, I think this was about when, like, terraforming was banned, and, did they limit... Oh my god, I have such bad memory. Did they limit some of the fusers? I think Merly and Havnus went to 1 here, right? But Shiren was still at 2? Yeah, because Shiren is still at 2 right now. So, I think this is where Merly and Havnus went to 1 and terraforming was banned? Maybe? Question mark? I'm really trying to remember, but, to be fair, in all fairness, we did see a bit more of diversity. Like, Sprite started to be able to compete more for that tier 1 slot with Tearlament at the time. But in hindsight, I think I would definitely put Sprite in tier 2, like, looking back. I think that was me liking the deck a lot. Like, yeah, I don't know. When I think about how the meta... It's funny I called this video, I think the meta is shaping up to be a ton of fun, because I think about how that meta actually shaped up. It just... The Bestials felt like they just further propagated Tearlaments. I think this ban list, or this tier list, must have been made around the time the ban list came out, because... I don't know, or maybe I was just more optimistic then than I feel now about it, which is not very at all. So, yeah, I think... Let me think about this for a second. I don't know. Yeah, I'm gonna put this in the C. I think this is gonna be a good season to put in the C tier here, because thinking about it, yeah, I think season 15 did just feel weirder and worse in hindsight. But like by season 18, even my Assault Synchron high had like worn down, and I was like okay, even I was at the point, because I enjoyed playing with Tearlaments quite a bit for the majority of the time they were out, but by this time, I think I was like, yeah, can we move on, please? I want the meta to have a bit more diversity now, please. Because even looking at the tier list I had made at that time, there was all of 4 decks that I put between tiers 1 and 2, right? And looking back, like even Sprites, I don't think were quite tier 1, quite on the same power level as Tearlaments. They should have been tier 2. And it's like, Branded Despia and Sword Soul felt like they were just kind of hanging on in there, right? It's like, I don't know. I think I'll put it in C tier. Season 19 saw the release of the second wave of Labyrinth support. And that was where Lab really started to shine. That's when we got the big welcome and the lady. Actually, what else came out in that pack? Let me actually look real quick. Okay, quick addendum I need to make here, by the way. This was the tier list I should have focused on when I was talking about season 18. Which this makes a lot more sense. This tier list makes a lot. I was thinking to myself, like, I really put Sprite in with Tearlament at that point in time. So, quick addendum I need to throw in here real quick is that this is what the tier list actually looked like, and this is more what I remember. So that makes a lot more sense. Okay, yeah, so now I've thrown in that addendum, and also the season 19 tier list. This is, again, weirdness where I would make the tier list, like, before the actual pack would come out. So this is the first tier list I made actually post-Labyrinth release. So even though this is the season 20 meta tier list, it's because we're going into season 20. This is kind of more reflective of season 19. So I'm going to use this here. Also, it was Dark World was the other major release with Labyrinth. That's what I was trying to remember. So the Dark World ended up like very slightly helping Tearlament, which was still at this point in time the top tier 1 deck. However, as the deck started to take those hits like the fusers and terraforming and stuff, I think that's where we kind of started to see Sprite kind of creep in and be able to compete as well. Which, to be fair, okay, I want to say this too. I meant to say this when I was talking more about season 16 and 17, the real tier 0 meta, but yeah, looking back, like, there were definitely a lot more decks that were competitively viable around that time than a lot of people give credit. Like, I just remember in particular, like, I was thinking, like, you know, around that time after I topped with Tearlament, I was thinking about just bringing pure Sprite to, like, you know, tournaments and stuff, and I remember people saying, not everybody at all, but there was a very small, maybe even 1 or 2 people who were like, you would be stupid to bring anything but tier limit. If you think you can top with pure sprite, you should just bring something else. And I like that's kind of the mentality that I think a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players tend to take with not only tier 0 metas, where they think, oh, if you're not bringing that one deck, you're just asking to lose. But like in general, even in non-tier 0 metas, players will still pick about like a range of 5 decks in their own brain and think to themselves, oh, if you're not bringing those decks, you're just asking to lose, which is never true, by the way. So yeah, I don't know. Like, even though tier limit was like super duper dominant, and it was definitely on a power level stance. Like, it was definitely above everything else. Like, looking back, there was a lot more room to explore than people gave credit for, which, not to shoot my own horn, but, I didn't take Pure Sprite the next week to the MCS. I took Punk Sprite instead, just to have fun, and then I topped with it. So, yeah, it was a time where I think less things were being tried out than there should have been because of the existence of tier limit and the prevailing attitude that players tend to have about the top deck or decks in any given meta. But so after Labyrinth came out, it had like a pretty decent impact. We saw it leave the Rogue tier and go up to tier 3. I don't know if it was like a tier 2 deck upon release. I just don't think that the meta tended to favor it that much. Like, Labyrinth felt a bit slow when tier limit was still going as strong as it was. And we also saw the Bestials give a lot of help to Dragon Link here, which I think this was just people. I think this could have been the case when those cards came out. I think we are only just now starting to see Dragon Link creep up at this point in the year because tier limit got hit and people were finally trying something else. Like, again, I think a lot of what holds decks back a lot of the time is not the actual card pool itself or the power level of that deck within that given card pool / meta, but the mentality that a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players tend to have of what is and isn't able to see success, which a lot of the time I find to be rather limited. So we also had Punk, I guess, start to see more popularity here. What was the release that made Punk better? Was it was Jan Dragon Drive released separately? No, it was Deer Note, right? Didn't Deer Note come out and that's what made Punk? That's right, it was. I think it was both, actually, now that I think about it. But it was definitely Deer Note. And yeah, that definitely shot Punk's power level up from a just kind of cute synchro deck that was not very consistent, at least not compared to post Deer Note, where, yeah, after Deer Note, you could go into that Punk line and end on the ability to Amazing Dragon for multiple bounces pretty much every single time. Oh, and the Field Spell, too. I think the Field Spell also came out in another wave of support, which, of course, that's going to hugely boost the power level of the deck, adding all those draws and the ability to extend very, very easily. So, yeah, cool stuff. So, Season 19, let's see, where would I put... I don't remember much about this season, to be frank. I really don't. I was probably just on, like, my Sprite variants at the time, just kind of vibing with those. I don't know. I think I'll put it... I'll actually put it in C. Nah, I'll put it in B. Because, like, I think for me, C and B were where I was, like, actively not having as much fun. But Season 19 wasn't not fun. It just doesn't really stand out in my memory that much. Season 19, in a way, well, really, / early Season 20, post-Labyrinth second wave release, kind of feels like the vibe of the whole year of playing Master Duel, honestly. So, yeah, I'll go ahead and put it here in B. I think the middle of the tier list is a good spot for it. Oh, and then Season 20. Season 20 I have represented by Kashtira Fenrir, because although Kashtira did not come out at full power at this time, it was definitely characterized, or the release around this time was definitely characterized by Fenrir coming out, because Fenrir started to see play in a lot of decks, and of course, still sees play in a lot of decks. I have definitely been pretty vocal about how I feel about Fenrir lately. I think it's too strong as a staple card, which is really, it's funny because whenever I say that, there's always a sect of comments that's like, how could you hate on Kashtira? And it's like, where did this sentiment for Kashtira come from? I thought people hated Kashtira, but okay, whatever, fine. For the record, and I say this every single time I talk about Fenrir getting limited, but every single time people still kind of paint me hating Kashtira. Fenrir does not need to go because Kashtira is too good. That is not what I think. I think that Fenrir, independently, as its own card, is too good. And I do still think Fenrir, in the end, should probably go to 0. That said, if Fenrir goes to 0, all other Kashtira cards could be at 3, and the deck would probably be completely fine. I need to say this slowly and carefully, because apparently it did not register the other 3 times I have said this in videos, that I do not think Kashtira as a whole is too strong. I think Fenrir is too strong. Get it? Got it? Good. Alright, so as far as this season as a whole, what did that tier list look like? Let's take a look here. Wow, so yeah, I think I titled this tier list video very aptly. I think this was where the meta was, like, very much at its most wide open. Okay, I think this was after, yes, I remember. This was after Tier Limit took its big hits. This was when, Merle got banned, and, well, that was the big hit, right? Which, okay, let me talk about that for a little bit here. The Merle ban. I don't often praise Konami especially in a very high way, but I will very much do it here. Merle to 0 was a genius hit. Nobody saw it coming, and I don't think any of us properly appreciated until after the fact, weeks after the fact, of just how great of a hit that was. It allowed Tier Limits to keep Kikalos and still be fine. It allowed it stopped Sprite Elf from getting banned, like, single-handedly. People talked so much at this time, and still honestly do, to this day, talk about how Sprite Elf is too generically powerful, when it was not. It was used with exactly Sprite cards and Tier Limits Merle. And, of course, that's being hyperbolic. There were a lot of decks that used it, but as far as, like, decks that are super meta relevant and see a lot of, like, actual success, then it was exactly Tier Limits and Sprites. I think people thought it was too generic because there were a lot of Sprite variants, and Elf showed up in exactly one other meta-relevant deck, but the Merle ban also prevented Sprint from being a guaranteed fusion with the Tier Limit deck as well. So, like, yeah, Merle ended up being a great hit. Merle to 0 was, I think, the best ban list change of the entire year. I'm very confident making that statement, honestly. And here's the other thing, too. I remember making this tier list, and I remember putting Tier Limit in Tier 2, and people were saying, nope, Tier Limit is dead in the water. The deck is rogue. It's terrible now. And that was very, very far from the truth. Like, I knew that was far from the truth at the time. I as always ever, I'm just adjusting the brim of my I told you so hat. But, like, if you look at, like, how the meta progressed later, like, okay, putting Tier Limits in Tier 2 was a bit high of me, but I don't think I was remiss if I had put them at the top of Tier 3, which is about the spot they've been, since this ban list change. And, yeah, again, this was at the time, the deck seeing, it's like I've said before, decks are only as powerful as they're allowed to be if people actually play them. And nobody was really trying Tier Limit right after this ban list change because everybody thought the deck was just dead in the water, and that could not have been further from the truth. So, I say this, I repeat this message, honestly, to kind of encourage people to always try something new. I think a lot of people's complaints about Yu-Gi-Oh! Comes from the fact that they think there are only a literal handful of decks that are competitively viable. And in that regard, if you think that, you are actively tanking your own enjoyment of the game. Because that is fundamentally untrue. There are, pretty much at any given point, in my opinion, even in a Tier 0 meta, there are at least 20 different decks that you could hit Master 1 with, or get a tournament top with. Like, at any given point in time. And that's, like, even during a Tier 0 meta. Like, right now, I've covered tier lists where I cover, like, 50 decks, and that's still not enough. That is actually still not enough to, again, cover everything that could either hit Master 1, or at the very least, sneak in a tournament top. And it's funny because whenever I say this, and you'll see this too whenever a rogue deck wins or does well in a tournament, you have people go like, oh, well, those tournaments were all just entered by bad players. And, like, if you think that, I'm sorry, you are determined. At that point, you are just determined to be wrong. Because if you think that if you're really undermining the success that people experience with rogue decks in tournaments, then and when you're not out there like actually winning or topping those tournaments yourself, you're the Yu-Gi-Oh equivalent of the middle-aged fat white American dude who yells at the sports screen for them to catch the ball already. It's like you have no place to critique or judge. And it's weird to me that the overall sentiment is that rogue decks should be able to do better, when the overall sentiment also seems to be, when rogue decks do well, that this is an anomaly. This tournament was full of bad players. This was a one-off occurrence. I really do think a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players are determined to be miserable. It really does kind of irk me, honestly, that is in my opinion, the overall vibe of our community. But that's a whole other video in and of itself. In any case, yeah, let's actually talk about this meta in particular. Cashiers were around, but they were very much like a bottom of tier 3 rogue deck because they did not have the second wave of support yet. Overall, again, I feel like my video title here was very apt. This meta was super duper wide open. Even though there weren't a lot of decks that were at tier 1 or 2, I don't think they stood super duper far above tier 3 or even rogue. I think, yeah, I think this meta was very wide open. So that being the case, I think I'm actually going to put it like in A, even above season 14. Like, although I might, it's not even that I dislike Fenrir as a card. That's another thing too. People are like, oh, Lex just hates Fenrir but loves Fountain. If you look at my channel, I play Fenrir in far more decks than I play Runic Fountain. I love it when people say like, oh, Lex just loves Runic. That's why they defend Fountain so hard. Nah. Check my videos. It's been over 7 months since I played a Runic deck. In fact, playing Naturia Runic was like the one time I started to fall asleep at my computer screen playing Master Duel. I think that deck is boring as fuck. I just don't let how I personally feel about a card or a deck interfere with where I think it should be on the tier list. So, okay, season 21, characterized by the release of Pearly, which was like one of the few instances, and it really was few if you think about it, where aside from like Tier Limit or Sprite, where we had an archetype get immediately introduced and then also immediately take the top tier 1 spot. Pearly did not come out at quite full power. It's actually still not out at full power. We actually have not gotten more Pearly cards, I think, aside from what came out in season 21. But yeah, the deck definitely took off right away. And indeed, here we have my tier list at the time. Wow, I did used to have that sprite really big, didn't I? I'm glad I resized that, but I will say, okay, and people said this in the comments when I made this tier list video. I don't know why I put Sword Soul at tier 1. I really could not tell you that. Sword Soul should absolutely be down here at tier 2. Probably even below Naturia Runic and Lab, to be honest. I really don't know why I thought this was a tier 1 deck. I think it's because I thought it had a flexible playstyle or something like that, but I think aside from, for some reason, putting Sword Soul in tier 1, I think we were still pretty spot on here with the meta. And really, the meta wasn't really that different. I said really twice there. Aside from Pearly coming in being the top tier 1 deck, Makonko came in, I think, surprised a lot of people with just how good it can be in a best of 1 format. Definitely myself included, for sure. But yeah, I don't think, aside from, you know, Pearly taking the top spot, that this format was too much different from the previous one. I don't think Pearly... Here's the thing, too, right? At the time, a lot of people complained that Pearly and the existence of Noir were very, very oppressive in the meta. I think oppressive might be a bit of a strong word. I think it was definitely too good compared to everything else. Again, we start to see a bit of power creep here, where it's not that every other deck was just bad. I think Pearly was just an inherently stronger deck than everything else. But, I don't know. I think at the same time, like, it wasn't that much stronger than even the things that were in tier 2 here. Like, yeah, you would decently, you know, you would expect to win playing Pearly against a lot of these decks a good amount of the time, but I don't think it dominated. It definitely didn't dominate nearly as hard as Tier Limit did, for sure. So where does that put Season 21 on the tier list here? I don't know. For me personally, I'm actually going to put it in C, because, like, I really don't like Pearly that much. I don't like playing it that much. I think it's fine as a deck in the meta. I think it's whatever. I think it's just like another style of deck, Towers Turbo, to be prepared for, right? It does require you to diversify your responses in that regard, which some people don't like having to do, like having to play an Underworld Goddess in the extra deck or something like that, but it's like whatever. But like, I don't know, because like I think about Season 21 compared to like Season 19, like Season 19 I have the most lukewarm feelings about, and Season 21 I do have a very similar stance on, but what's going to bump it down very slightly for me is just the fact that I just don't really like playing with Pearly that much. I was like, this deck is kind of whatever, so... Okay, Season 22. Now we're getting into like the most recent releases here. Season 22 brought the second wave of Kashtira support, most notably Kashtira Arise Heart. And at the time, I made a certain tweet, which was one of the first ones that like, one of my first opinion tweets that I had a lot of people really started like dog on or pile on for, where I said that, I can actually just bring it up here now that I think about it. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go to all that trouble. It'd take a lot of searching. Basically, I made a tweet saying, like, I don't think Kashtira is going to be as oppressive in Master Duel as it was in TCG or OCG. Arise Heart doesn't have any inherent protection, and the deck feels really bricky. Because I remember doing test hands with Kashtira, like I do with any deck, especially decks that I expect are going to be like a top tier 1 deck. As it was coming out before, you know, the weeks before it came out in Master Duel, I was doing test builds and gold fishing and trying to find the most consistent build I could. And when I got to Kashtira, I realized, like, oh, there's not, like, a consistent build for this deck because Pot of Prosperity and the Field Spell are at 1. And then I realized, like, wait a second. I don't think Kashtira is going to be, like, the top tier 1 deck. And a lot of people really ragged on me for that. A lot of people really said that I was, like, super missing the point. I got called a dumb Master Duel player a lot because, and to be fair, I don't have an experience with TCG or OCG, but, again, that was when I first put on the I told you so hat because I fucking told everyone. Yeah, Kashtira was like totally fine. And I think looking back, like I hedge and put Kashtira at the bottom of tier 1, but like, yeah, no, I totally should just put it like down here in tier 2. Like that's definitely where it actually was in this given meta. Pearly and Lab were definitely noticeably above the rest. Lab getting a noticeable power boost because of the release of the Karma Cannon and having a way to out the Ex-Pearly Noir, which was one of the most powerful things to have to be able to out at that time in the meta. That's why I think Lab uniquely saw a tier 1 spot at this particular time in the meta. But like, I hedged, again, I hedged putting Kashtira at the bottom of tier 1. And looking back, no, I should have just put it down here in tier 2. Yeah. And, you know, I think it's pretty hard to deny in hindsight that that was the case. Oh, and then this is when Gishki Sprite came out, too. Yeah, in hindsight, I am glad I put it in upper row, because that's only where it ever ended up being. Although, I've said since then, and I'll continue to say, as I see people in my Discord especially experiment with Gishki Sprite, this is one of those decks where I feel like if it just got enough representation, it might be the bottom of tier 3. It's one of those decks where, as I've said multiple times, it's not that the deck is bad, I think people just don't play it, and there is definitely a difference between the two. So Season 22, I'm going to put, like, I think I'll actually put it here in B, because it was pretty much the same as Season 21, but at the very least, the release of Kashtira's and, like, Gishkis and stuff mixed things up a little bit, so, yeah, I'm willing to put Season 22 in B, below Season 19. You know what? I think Season 19 is very slightly below Season 22 for me, just because it doesn't stand out for me that much. Again, I think if this season was meh, fine, didn't stand out, whatever, it should be the middle of the tier list. So, yeah, I'll put it right here at the bottom of B. Alright, Season 23, we're coming up on some very recent ones now. Singularity bolstered, and the Firewall cards in general hugely bolstered the power of the Math Mech cards. We also, of course, had the Spirits come out around the same time, just a couple of weeks beforehand, which in turn also helped out the Math Mech deck. And of course, we not only had the Mathmech deck come out around this time, or get bolstered in power level around this time, but Vanquish Soul also debuted here. Oh, this was also when, this was also the one tier list where for some reason it did not auto, like, adjust the size or ratios of the images, so it was all out of whack here. But, oh yeah, and this was when I covered 50 decks on the tier list, which, again, I'll tell you, I don't think that's enough still. Like, at that point in time, about a month ago, or almost 2 months ago now, and at this point in time, again, if we are considering every deck that can hit Master 1 or sneak in a tournament top to be good and at least rogue tier, then there are far more than 50 decks that we need to consider. But yeah, as far as like this tier list goes and where I ranked everything, I think it was about right. Like, maybe Vanquish Soul actually should have been in tier 1. Maybe there were just 5 tier 1 decks. I had a couple people say I was coping to put Mathmech at the top of tier 1, but in hindsight, I definitely do think that Mathmech is the top of tier 1. Now and at this time as well. So this one's a little more recent, so I guess I don't have as much to say about it because, like, this is pretty much, like, very, very close to what the current meta looks like anyway, so. Season 23 was definitely a lot of fun for me to, like, really revisit Mathmech. I think I'm going to put it in S, but I'm going to put it a little bit below Season 13 because I think what a lot of the fun I had in Season 23 was revisiting the fun I had playing Mathmech in Season 13. So, yeah, I think that's a good spot for me personally to put this Season 23 here. And finally, this latest Season 24, I've decided to use Dispater because, like, I thought about using a Manadium monster, but I feel like Dispater, as a single representation of the release, is the most, like, representative of the meta impact here, because Dispater brought power to a lot of decks. We also definitely saw a resurgence of Branded here, with this most recent release here in Season 24. And so here we have the final tier list we're going to be looking at, which is the one I put out just yesterday. So obviously it's this is also a post-ban list tier list, so this is Season 25 in mind, of course. Again, I talked about this very tier list just yesterday, so if you want to check out what I think the post-ban list Season 25 tier list is going to look like, well, this is it. And you can hear me go into more detail there, but I think this is also fairly representative of where the meta is right now as well. I would maybe just put Pearly in tier 1 pre-ban list, but post-ban list, yeah, I think it's going to be in tier 2. So, again, I don't have much to say here right now because I said a lot about this tier list yesterday. But looking back on this past month, this past December here, and where I would put this season compared to everything else, I had a lot of fun this season. There was a lot of really cool decks to try out between Ringo Worm bolstering the power of Sprite Synchro, Rip Chaos Ruler, as well as Manadium coming out, being able to play Visus Piles, Branded having a lot of options, including Sanctifier, which I maintain, much like Expulsion did, will at some point need to go, but yeah, I don't know. As far as where I'd put this, I've been having a lot of fun. Did I have more fun? You know what? I think I had more fun exploring all the stuff this season than I did last season with just Mathmech. So I'm going to make one last adjustment and put Season 23 down here at the top of A, and I'll put Season 24 up here at the top of B. And there we have it. This is my personal tier list of how much fun I had in each season of Master Duel this year. Again, Season 17 being the top probably looks really weird to a lot of people because I think a lot of people, and understandably so, would have it like here at the bottom, but uniquely because Assault Synchron came up and just showed me a whole new world of synchro summoning and cool pile decks, I had to put it at the top. But otherwise, I think at the very beginning of the year, that format was a lot of fun with Circular and Linkage having just come out, and everything felt like it was at a very balanced power level. I kind of feel like that's where we are right now too, honestly, relatively speaking. But yeah, no, I've been having a lot of fun lately. As you can see, I put Season 24 and 23 right up here towards the top, so Season 24, of course, because it expanded upon the style of deck I already loved in Season 17, but yeah, no, I think this is just about where I would personally put the various seasons of this past year of Master Duel. But what about you? How do you feel about 2023 in Master Duel? Did you have fun? Did you not? Let me know either way. Feel free to comment in the comment section below. But I think that's going to go ahead and do it for this year in review. So before I end off the video, I need to give a massive thank you to everyone who supported me this year. This year was pretty wild. Like last year, of course, just the explosion of the channel when I started making Master Duel videos and just getting like noticed, I guess, quote unquote, period, was huge. But this year was also massively huge in terms of things that changed. Like, we started playing tournaments and like actually topping them and doing well. And I was so relieved when I topped my first MCS, because I had this moment of like, okay, I finally feel justified in everything I've been talking about as far as my knowledge of the game. Like, oh, it was very much a sigh of relief for me to like feel like I had some kind of like tangible result. To also meeting a ton of really cool friends and people just in general. You know, we started bringing guests on this year. That's how I've made a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh friends I have made. We set up the Discord this year. That has been a huge boost as far as like just feeling more like we're a community. And I wish I had done it sooner, honestly. A lot of the reason it took me so long to set up a Discord server is because it's a lot of the same reason why it took me so long to finally get into streaming, like, regularly, which we also did this year, which was, like ever since I kind of came out, ever since I did come out on the channel that I use they, she pronouns, which, I've talked about this on Twitter, but that day I first said in a YouTube video that I use they, she pronouns, which was the day I talked about playing in the Girl Power Yu-Gi-Oh tournament. That was the biggest drop I've ever had in terms of like subscribers. It was the first day I ever had a net loss of subscribers, and moving forward after that day, there was a noticeable drop in the number of subscribers and views. Like, going back and making this video and looking at my older videos, like, there is a noticeably higher viewer count, and the shift, I mean, there's no inferring about it. The shift was when I came out as you know, using they, she pronouns. And it's funny because a lot of people said I was doing it for clout and to get more popular. No, I have hard objective evidence that literally the exact opposite happens. But, you know, at the same time, that is really what kind of made me, that ultimately is what made me feel more comfortable, I think, starting the Discord and streaming. I initially felt uncomfortable doing those things because I had come out and because I thought I was just going to have people being shitty. And very, 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 very occasionally, someone will try to be shitty. But like, literally, I'm not even exaggerating, like 99.5% of the time, it's just people excellent being on the Discord and on the streams. Like, I so rarely have to delete nasty on the Discord, I've never had to delete a nasty comment, which is very nice, but it's mostly a YouTube thing where that happens. But anyway, yeah, no, I really gotta thank you all so much for this year. I feel a lot more part of the Yu-Gi-Oh community this year than I did at the start of it. At the start of it, I very much still felt like just somebody who was playing Master Duel and making videos about it. And that's what I was too, because I wasn't really I wasn't communicating with people in the community. But yeah, now we are, and it's great, and it's awesome. So thank you everyone for an awesome 2023. There were some like rough patches, but like, of course, you know, there are always going to be over the course of the whole fucking year. I think it was characterized mostly by just how excellent we all have been lately, especially. So thank you very much. Yeah, that's gonna go ahead and do it for me for this video for this year. But that's definitely, of course, not the end of Master Duel here on this channel. We have a whole year ahead of us. We have a ban list coming up that we have to get ready for. And as such, I will definitely be seeing you in the next one. Let's go ahead and move to our outro, though. Alright everybody, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching it all the way to the very end. That means a whole lot to me, and it's also a fantastic way to support the channel. And if you're interested in supporting the channel in other ways besides YouTube, there are plenty of ways to do that. If you check out the description below, you'll find a bunch of links down there. One of them goes to my Patreon. You're actually seeing the names of everyone subscribed to the Patreon on the screen right now. So if you're interested in getting your name in the credits here at the end, if you want to see more daily Master Duel content, or if you're interested in one-on-one private coaching sessions, I offer all of that on Patreon. I also stream live on Twitch. Feel free to go ahead and click that link and follow and or subscribe there. I also have the Discord community, if you want to follow that link, where hundreds of duelists have already signed up. Free to join, and you can just come hang out, talk about the game, and chill in general. Final link that's going to be in the description is my Twitter. You can follow that if you want some more notifications of what's happening with the channel. So, all in all, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.